totally free. Just search
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. And for our third segment of today's show, we continue with this trend of talking about what could be next for all 12 CFP teams. And for today, we are looking at perhaps the most shocking of them all, the Arizona State Sun Devils. What a story they were the 2024 college football season. Let's talk about them a little bit. They were picked last in many a Big 12 preseason poll, not necessarily seen as some team that could break out at all this season after a 3-9 season in the first year of the Kenny Dillingham era. But in year two, a complete turnaround led by redshirt freshman Sam Leavitt and all-purpose player Cam Skattebo. This team completely turned its identity around and became the Big 12 champion and ultimately took Texas to one of the best games in the CFP era to overtime. And so I feel like a lot of people might be saying, well, after such an incredible season, after such an incredible turnaround, there's likely going to be a little bit of regression from this team. We see it with all, in fact, Big 12 teams that have overachieved in their own right and made the CFP. We saw with TCU most recently in terms of how they declined after their run at the national championship game. But ultimately, the reason why I feel Arizona State could continue with this success in the Big 12 is A, because no one saw them coming this year, and B, they're not necessarily losing too much production. And as a school in the Big 12 who's one of the smaller schools in that conference, they have the advantage of finding these hidden gems and developing them better than any other elite program really can. Because it's what they did with Cam Skattebo, who is now departing for them. But ultimately, that's what I like about a program like Arizona State. You find the guys in the recruiting trail who you invest in and you build them up. And Kenny Dillingham proved that in spades this year. And I'm not counting him out as being one of the elite coaches in college football for the next 5 to 10 years because of what he did this year and because of what he has and what he's able to do in the coming years ahead. But ultimately, we do have to talk about the elephant in the room and how they replace a guy like Cam Skattebo in their offense. And also, how to ensure that redshirt freshman Sam Leavitt does ultimately continue to improve after an incredible freshman season without elite weapons in Xavier Gilroy and Melquan Stovall at his disposal this year. So it's all about replacement and ultimately retooling for this Arizona State squad, but I believe they're better equipped than anyone to do it. So without further ado, let's talk about what they need to do and what could be next for this program to really skyrocket these next couple of years. So obviously, let's talk about Cam Skattebo and what you have to replace there. You have to replace the second most scrimmage yards last season behind only Ashton Jeanty with 1,711 yards. You have to replace the 21 touchdowns, and you have to replace one of the best games in college football playoff history where he garnered 450 all-purpose yards in a literal puke and rally game that ultimately took Texas to overtime. And I feel like, it's going to be very hard, but they do have a very deep backfield this year, supplemented by one of the more underrated, in my opinion, transfer portal additions of the offseason. One of the only military service academy transfers of the offseason as well. Kanye Udo of Army, leaving the option offense and going to pastures new, coming to Arizona State. And while I definitely view this as a very funny transfer in terms of moving from a very disciplined school in Army to one of the biggest party schools in the nation, it's still an astute pickup by Arizona State. I feel like, yes, the option offense is going to have to be worked out of him, and he's going to have to coalesce with Sam Leavitt, a dual-threat quarterback in his own right in the backfield. But I really like what Kanye Udo can bring, because he's also much like Cam Scadaboo, a very physical back who is more so built in running people over than finesse. They have some finesse guys like Raleek Brown in their backfield as well, but I do really like the continuity of bringing someone in like a Kanye Udoh to take over. And I feel like combined with Sam Levitt, who in his own right can create out of structure, and with his legs, I feel like it's the perfect balance as well. And Kanye Udoh's transition from that option offense over Army to this offense at Arizona State will be seamless just because of the fact that it's not like he's not Cam Scadaboo and is someone who can just break off 75-yard runs like an Ashton Genty with finesse alone. I feel like he's built in the image of what Arizona State want, and I really like what he brings. He himself ran for over 1,100 yards, even in an offense heavily tailored to Bryson Daly. So I do feel like Kanye Udoh could be a very, very smart pickup by the end of 2025 for Arizona State if they play their cards right. But in terms of recruiting, not necessarily too much on that front in terms of big players that can make differences in places where holes need to be filled. But they do add two very intriguing players. They add ESPN 300 QB Cameron Dyer, one of the better dual threat QBs in this year's class, and I think he's a very interesting option to learn behind Sam Levitt, as both of them have dual threat abilities, and it's a ESPN 300 prospect that a school like Arizona State wouldn't even dream of having a couple of years ago. So that's the advantage of making the CFP saying, hey, we can build on this year together, come join us. And then a 3-star safety who's highly underrated in this year's class, Joseph Smith, and highly underrated in terms of filling the shoes of someone like a Shamari Simmons, who's one of the most elite players in their defense, and who they heavily missed in the CFP. So ultimately, Joseph Smith could be a very interesting addition, but not necessarily too much on the recruiting front. Now let's get into why Arizona State is so special. Because with this season under their belts, they're even bigger players in the transfer portal, where it matters, especially in the Big 12, because the Big 12 is now losing a lot of its luster. It's now perhaps the 4th best conference in the Power 4, but it's still the toughest conference to play in the Power 4 as well. So, because of that, you're going to have to be very proactive in quickly replacing the talent and production that is leaving your team if you're in the Big 12. And that's what really hampered TCU, as they could not replace guys like Duggan, guys like Johnston with transfer portal additions. But because Arizona State proved they can hang with a team like Texas in the CFP, proved that you can go here and succeed, and it's starting to become a little bit more attractive to a lot of these transfer kids. And because they're a party school, I gotta harp on that Kanye Udoh move as well. But ultimately, one other area of need that I view a little bit more highly on the list than replacing Cam Scadaboo's production is wide receiver. Levitt had a great year in spite of what he had in his wide receiver core, because outside of Jordan Tyson, who was luckily returning for him, they didn't have much. And much as I liked what Xavier Gilroy and Melquan Stovall could do, they didn't necessarily give you that much production. They only had, 800 and 600 yards respectively. I feel like you want another winner on the perimeter if you're Arizona State. Another guy in the slot who's a little bit more savvy in terms of helping Sam down low to ultimately offset what Jordan Tyson can do. Because I need to see if I'm Arizona State rather, a little bit more balance out of this wide receiver core. Jordan Tyson can't be the dominant force for another year for Arizona State if they want to get back to the CFP at that point. But I do like the risk they are taking in the transfer portal, because they brought in 3 receivers who I think can really help in different areas. They brought in an unproven guy, a redshirt freshman in Noble Johnson who didn't play much at Clemson. They brought in the number 2 tight end in the transfer portal in Kamari Anderson out of Kentucky. But the guy who I'm most intrigued by is Jalen Moss out of Fresno State. This is going to be his junior season, but ultimately I really like what he profiles as in this Arizona State offense. He can be kind of the complementary piece to Jordan Tyson here. He had 1,200 receiving yards, over 1,200 receiving yards in his career at Fresno State. Former 3-star prospect. Last year, he kind of saw his numbers drop a little bit. Only 563 yards and 4 touchdowns to account for. But ultimately, I feel like in a world where you're a team like Arizona State, these are ultimately the guys who we were looking for. These are ultimately the hidden gems who become the Cam Scadaboos of your team. And so that's what I like about knowing what you need to replace, to bolster, and ultimately taking risks, willing to be able to take risks, for that matter, on players like a Jalen Moss or a Noble Johnson. Because while they might seem unproven, that goes to show they're willing to be molded by a team like yourself. Because if I'm looking as a transfer to go to a team, and I'm thinking, well, I want a team with a high profile, but not necessarily a team where, I'll be forced to be the star for most of my career, Arizona State certainly becomes appealing because you get an opportunity in the Big 12 to play in one of the toughest conferences in the country, but you're not going to be too heavily scrutinized, and you have the opportunity to become an underrated superstar, much like Cam Scadaboo was all throughout last year. So if I'm Jalen Moss and Noble Johnson, I'm really excited about this in terms of the trajectory of my career, because it really proves that even though the reputation that Arizona State gets, it's an astute move just because I'm now learning in an offense that can produce guys who go under the radar throughout their career, who become hidden gems for their school, who lead their school ultimately to the CFP like Cam Scadaboo, and most importantly are willing to develop and grow in their own right. So if I'm Arizona State, I should be very happy about what I've been able to do already in the offseason, because it's what you need to do as a school in the Big 12 who has a very challenging path to the CFP. No matter what, outside of the reputation of your conference, you have to play tough physical teams week in, week out. So if I'm Kenny Dillingham, if I'm the Arizona State organization or athletics program, I have to be really, really thrilled for the future. Because even though you lost a lot of production, a lot of talent, you built him up. You built up Cam Scadaboo. And what you can do now is dip into the portal and go again. And I feel like Arizona State has proven that they're willing to do that and follow that model for as long as Kenny Dillingham as their coach, and for as long as players are willing to invest in this small school. But let me know what you think about this rebuild in the comments below for Arizona State, because coming up next, we are ranking the NFL head coaching hirings thus far. We're still waiting on the New Orleans Saints job to be filled, but ultimately the 5 head coaches who've been hired are all great in their own right. But let's see how I rank them after this short break.